Well, I've just finished rereading, or reading really for the first time completely anyway, this book, Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Humanism and Terror. I guess I want to say it's one of the most disturbing things I've ever read. A real, I don't know, it it refutes humanism, but I'm reading it more like a refutation of the human in general. Like, if you can do this, if you can believe this, if you can persuade yourself like this of stuff like this, then maybe we should start again. But anyway, yeah, it's a justification. It's published in 47, just coming right off of World War II. And it's a justification of Stalin. It's a justification of show trials in which, for example, Stalin had Lenin's entire Politburo executed. It's a justification of the forced collectivization of agriculture and industry, the forced collectivization programs under Stalin, which killed millions. Merleau-Ponty is explicitly okay with that. This whole book is an attempt to say that's okay. The liquidation of the kulaks. I mean, it's impossible not to read all these categories as fantastic fictions, if you ask me, the kulaks. But they're not a fantastic fiction in the sense that there were actual people that got displaced and liquidated in this class fantasy. So yeah, I know I was going to do the next episode on Sartre, and I probably still am going to do an episode on Sartre. Of course, they were friends, maybe even rivals for the hand of Ms. Beauvoir, etc., except they were too hip to marry, I suppose. Although Simone found Merleau-Ponty too bourgeois and conventional, which may be why he ended up doing some stuff like this, where he's like out Marxing Marx, out Stalining Stalin. I mean, I guess we'll just do a little context. Like, okay, if we were making excuses for this, it's coming right out of working in the resistance in World War II, okay, on behalf, and this is what one of the places where it might occur to you, like you only have two choices. They are Marxism and fascism. You must choose right now. So you must choose totalitarianism. And, this is a practical thing, but actually he really tries to corner you throughout this book into just that. Like, there's only two choices, Marxism or evil. So you gotta choose evil. You gotta choose evil. That's for sure. All right. All right. So, and let's, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the people I've talked about so far in this series have just been completely undeniable giants. And Merleau maybe is not quite on the same level as Heidegger, Hegel, Plato, all right, but he's very big. After Husserl, he's the number one phenomenologist. I would have said, my friend Glenn is an expert on Merleau, but I haven't really drenched in Merleau, but I would have said that his phenomenology is very salutary, like really great, like a kind of a great cure for a lot of the problems of Western philosophy, like re-emphasizing the body, re-emphasizing like ordinary human experience and what it's like, and trying to build a philosophy on that basis, a new philosophy. which more in touch with of reality of the human body in an environment. Right? So, and I guess most people wouldn't think of Merleau as a political philosopher, definitely not primarily. And I don't suppose until I started exploring various aspects of like the history of 20th century Marxism and stuff that I would have thought of Merleau as a political thinker or worried about Merleau's politics. But it's a beautiful example for a lot of what we're talking about now. I don't believe that in Hannah Arendt's book, Origins of Totalitarianism. I just looked in the index. She does not refer to Merleau-Ponty. But this whole thing is so beautifully designed to confirm Hannah Arendt's account of the origins of totalitarianism, and in particular, despite Merleau's constant refrain that this is false, the parallels between Stalinism and Hitlerism, and between Marxism and fascism, which are so striking that neither the Marxists nor fascists can see them at all. Right? But they spend lots and lots of time denying it. He has an amazing account of that. I just wanted to do this as a bit of a start. I have so many quotes from here that I want to get to, man. Like, I don't know, man. It's like reading Mein Kampf, but from a major great philosopher. It really is. It really is like arguing for liquidation of groups and stuff like this. It is. The opponents of Marxism, says Merleau, this is 124 of this edition. Use the translator here. John O'Neill. The opponents of Marxism, writes Merleau, never failed to compare this totalitarian method, totalitarian in quotes, lots of totalitarianism in quotes. Frederick Jameson likes to do that, like this, like people trying to warn you about the specter of so-called totalitarianism. Oh man, that just means they fear collective action in general, which is totalitarian if you're Jameson. Compare this totalitarian method with the fascist ideology, which also pretends to go from the formal to the actual. Maybe we'll discuss this a little bit. From the contractual to the organic. But the comparison is in bad faith. This is existentialism of the 40s. The comparison is in bad faith. For fascism is nothing but a mimicry of Bolshevism. Fascism, it's not because the Bolsheviks are imitating the fascists. The similarities, which don't exist at all, but it's bad faith to say they exist, but are very striking, come from the fact that the fascists are imitating the Bolsheviks. Okay, I'll take that. I guess you got to do the research to figure out who influenced who, right? But if the fascists were imitating the Bolsheviks in their totalitarian methods, that wouldn't surprise me. That would explain a lot. Okay. And Merleau is proud of that, I guess, or like he regards this as a response to the claim that fascism and communism resemble one another. No, they don't. Yes, they do, because fascism is imitating communism. It's amazing what happens to people's heads when they get around this stuff. A single-party propaganda. Now let's enumerate some of the similarities. A single-party propaganda, the justice of the state, the truth of the state. Fascism retains everything of Bolshevism, except what is essential, namely the theory of the proletariat. So they're identical systems. Wow. Okay. But the difference is One likes classes and one likes races. This is just what I was saying, have been saying. This is just exactly the difference between communism, Marxist communism, and fascism. One likes the collective agents to be races, and one likes it to be classes. Fourth, the proletariat is the force on which revolutionary society is based. And if the proletariat is that universal class we have described from Marx, then the interests of this class, being human values, bring human values into history, and the proletariat's power is the power of humanity. Many, many if-then sentences in this book are crackpot if you look at them for a second. Okay? I invite you to analyze that one, if-then. If the proletariat is the force on which revolutionary society is based, and if the proletariat is a universal class, then the interests of this class bring human values into history. What is the universal class? I'm trying to remember that. Fascist violence, by contrast, is not the violence of a universal class. Not at all. No, and this is really fucked up. It's the violence of a race or a late starting nation. Germany, I guess. It does not follow the course of things, but pushes against them. Okay, so this is all, this is an amazing admission by Marxist Merleau. The systems are the same, except one is about races, one is about classes. But classes really are the collective identities, and races really aren't. Right, well, that suggests the response on behalf of a Nazi. No, races really are real and classes aren't. The Aryan is the universal race, the hope of history or whatever, How would I decide between these positions? Just start executing people by the millions. That's the only way to adjudicate between these two beautiful visions, which Merleau affirms are identical, except for that one little detail, proletariat versus Aryan. All right. Anyway, whatever. Look, they differ in what fictions they enthuse about. All right. Now, the real theme of this book, Humanism and Terror by Merleau-Ponty, is the predominant theme. It starts as a response a response to and almost a review of and a takedown of Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, the novel that depicts Soviet show trials. Okay. And the first chapter of this book is devoted to trying to disassemble Koestler and Koestler's character. And the second chapter is about the real trial of Nikolai Bukharin, Bukharin, who was a top advisor to Lenin, maybe as good a philosopher and thinker as the Soviets ever produced, or Soviet communism, especially early on, ever produced. An excellent, just the opposite of Stalin in a way, like a real good writer and intellectual. Someone who you might want to be your official ideologue, and he did sort of function that way early on. All right. But then, in the late 30s, he was one of layers of officials that Stalin's people put on trial, accused of bourgeois tendencies or helping the fascists or Germans or something like this. And Bukharin, it was a much more complex trial than some. He did end up accusing himself, writhing in the dock about his own reactionary treasons and shit. Okay. And the purpose of Merleau-Ponty is to justify the execution of Nikolai Bukharin, but all the executions. And to do this, he develops an incredibly distorted theory of truth and a whole ethics. Like, he develops and deploys a whole philosophy to justify mass murder and ideological repression of the most brutal kinds. It's almost a refutation of philosophy, in the sense that the skills he has, has developed with this really beautiful philosophical training that he had, enable him to justify whatever atrocities he's in the mood to justify, whenever he's in the mood to justify them. It could have been Hitler, I guess. I mean, he'll scream on that one. He'll tell me I don't know how to read, which is what he said to all his critics of this book. You don't know how to read. Yeah, well, I guess I don't, man. Like, boy, oh boy. I guess it's worth saying that one more time, that all these people soaked in Hegel. This is obvious throughout Merleau's book. Toward the end, he comes right on back to Hegel. Merleau studied Hegel with Alexander Kojève, like many people did. And Hegel is at the heart of his whole view of history. He regards Marx as Hegel, as the realization of Hegel's philosophy and so on. He says that. Right? So these monstrous justifications of mass murder, Heidegger's, although not usually in his philosophy books per se, like Merleau and Merleau's, come not surprisingly from drenching in Hegel. All right. He right at the end, he just comes back to, this is just Hegel's state again. The Soviets or whatever, with this slight displacement of what the basic collective consciousnesses are. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about truth, like what he does with truth. So he's talking about Bukharin's trial. The accusation can only rely on a few facts because the opposition's activities were not strictly acts of treason or sabotage, and only fell within the jurisdiction of the constitutional laws of the state through interpretation, even though they were accused of treason and sabotage. The trials remain on a subjective level and never approach what is called true justice and objective and timeless, because they bear upon facts still open toward the future, which consequently are not yet univocal and only acquire a definitively criminal character when they are viewed from the perspective on the future held by the men in power. All right, so now this appears to be a criticism of the show trials, okay, but it's not. He's going to respond to this criticism of the show trials with a different theory of truth. If we thought about what happened and how people were thinking about what they were doing when these right-wing Trotskyist tendencies or whatever the fuck we're talking about, because it's crazy yip-yap, were in process, they did not amount to treason and sabotage by any reasonable legal standards. Okay, these were enthusiastic Soviet revolutionaries. Treason and sabotage? Nikolai Bukharin? In the Politburo? What? Okay, and so here's the response. Right, it wasn't treason and sabotage. Not when it happened. But from the perspective of the leadership who are envisioning the future, this undermined what turned out to be the desired direction. which was the liquidation of the kulaks. So, from the point of view of the leadership, who now were envisioning a future, it's true that these were acts which were acts of sabotage and treason. So, he doesn't do this in a super systematic way, but he gives it a bit of a shot. Let's reconceive truth now. Not as what happened, let's say, but as what leaders think will happen in the future. And if you're undermining that projected future, then you're a traitor and saboteur no matter what you think you're doing or no matter what you are actually doing, as far as we can tell right now. So, Nikolai Bukharin was guilty of treason and sabotage, not because of anything he did or anything he thought, but because of the way the leaders at that moment Stalin came to think about the future. To go against Stalin, wrote two Russian authors, this is on page 30, would mean going against collectivization, against the 5-year plans, against socialism. That would mean joining the camp of the enemies of socialism and the Soviet Union, going over to the fascist camp. This puts the discussion on the proper level. So we're in a period in which Lenin's Politburo is thrashing around on who's going to be the successor and what the policies are going to be. And at first, if you're going against Stalin, you're just trying to help the revolution to succeed, nurture it along, as Lenin advised. This is what Bukharin thought he was doing. But if you are opposing Stalin then, as we can see now, if you're expressing any opposition to Stalin then, as we can see now, if you were dissenting at all from Stalin's forced collectivization, etc., you were going against socialism. What does it mean to go against socialism? It means to be a fascist. There's only two options: for us or against us, with us or against us. Okay, so criticizing or even discussing the policy of forced collectivization in any critical way, when it was proposed by Stalin before he consolidated all power, made you a fascist. Even though you're the most sincere, read Bukharin, the most sincere communist that was ever existed. All right, what does truth now mean? All right, and what are we putting people on trial and executing them for? Not what they did or what they thought, but how Stalin came to interpret them, as if we ran it through a world in which there were only two possibilities, both of them monstrously violent. So criticizing Stalin and forced collectivization at that early point was going over to the fascist camp. That puts the discussion on the proper level, says Merleau. It also means recognizing that the Moscow trials are not an act of timeless justice, but a phase in the political struggle and an expression of violence in history. One thing he says is that he has a totalizing view, and he attributes everything to Marx, that the legal and the ethical and the historical are all one total reality. For even if, after the event, this evaluation of the opposition's historical role appears correct, that they were sincerely opposing it because they were concerned with the future of the revolution, in view of the outbreak of war in 1938, it could not have passed for an indisputable truth. At that time, it was a subjective view open to error. The Moscow sentences were not yet the very judgment of history, and they necessarily had an arbitrary look. It is always that way. Okay. The Moscow sentences were not the very judgment of history, and hence completely legitimate and inevitable in that way, until they were made. The accusations became true during the trial. So what does he think about truth? What is his ethics? All right. The Marxist defendants, in this case, being in agreement over the principle of historical responsibility, became their own prosecutors. If one proceeds in accordance with strict Marxist methods, from historical circumstances to the trials themselves, this makes it possible to understand the proceedings. It ought to reveal, unless we are mistaken, the two senses possessed by the facts, by the same facts. Two senses possessed by the same facts, depending on whether they are viewed from a perspective of the future or some other viewpoint, and how the two senses fuse with one another so that opposition is treason and treason is opposition. Okay, a couple things here. First of all, the defendants in the show trials became their own accusers. This is true because they were tortured and beaten into submission, and they signed confessions. And Merleau-Ponty takes that incredibly seriously. He believes every word of their forced confessions, because that's the kind of philosopher Merleau-Ponty has become in 1947. And then he's got this idea that there are two sets of facts, one of which happened and one of which is a matter of ideological interpretation. Now, the fact that these contradict one another, like on one of these, Nikolai Bukharin is innocent of treason, and on the other he's guilty, Merleau doesn't quite grapple with that, okay? But I think the only coherent position that leads to his what he ends up saying is that the future is erased. The past is erased by the present judgment, that there are no facts of history. There are only facts of power. There are only facts of what is needed now into the future. It might be some kind of pragmatic view, some monstrous pragmatism. There's no such thing as truth, only what works in the future. It is this monster pragmatism here. So the negotiation here is between a liberal theory of truth, on which things actually happen and have properties and stuff, and a radical or revolutionary, as he calls it, account of truth, on which the past becomes the lead up to the revolution. That all facts are refixable, re-narratable. There's no truth whether you are a traitor now until we put you on trial. And when we convict you, then you were always a traitor. It's not that we've shown what's true, we've made it true. Now, this is infested with a Hegelian account of history. It's so where at least apparently you can make things retroactively true by reinterpreting them now. right? Where each thing that ever happened is understandable in terms of what eventually will happen, or the end of the whole universe, or the end of history, at which it's all been aiming. And we can't know what anything means until it's all over. And so you could use that as an excuse for doing anything, including millions of executions. I mean, this book is just full of excuses. And what it says basically is like, all history is violent. Everyone's violent. So yeah, we're violent. All kinds of violence sucks, but our kind of violence sucks less than most. And here's one reason why: because our violence is dedicated to the eventual end of violence. That is, we're going to do a hyper-violent, and Merleau's really into this, man, a hyper-violent, executing genocide style intervention in history. And then it's going to be humanism. What? From then on. Then we can talk about equality. Then we can talk about respecting persons. Then we can talk about the value of speaking the truth. Then we can talk about freedom of expression. Then we can talk about releasing the prisoners from the gulags. Right. Until then, no such luck, bro. Right. So it's one of the worst versions of this withering away of the state I ever heard, which is just like, we need max oppression. And then we will, and he just says, so that's what we believe because we're Marxists, and Marxism is untranscendable. You're never going to get beyond it. Sartre says the same thing. There's no place beyond Marxism. What the fuck, dude? What are you saying, man? And who the hell are you? Because those things are not this orthodox ideologue thing. Did you know about yourself that you had the capacity to do that? Right. Well, this does represent a certain moment, and Merleau's politics mellowed in some way. I mean, I want to think that he looked in the mirror and saw a monster that wrote that book, Humanism and Terror. And then he wrote another book called Adventures in the Dialectic, which is Marxism in a milder way. It doesn't just straightforwardly enthuse about lying and liquidating people. Okay, it's also a little farther from World War II, which is one way that's got so damn polarized between these delightful totalitarians of the left and right. It won't matter whether they're on the left or the right when they come for you, baby.